On December 6, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt reviewed urgent diplomatic cables from Japan in the White House. Tensions grew as U.S. intelligence intercepted hints of a larger, darker plot, and Roosevelt confided to his aide, "This means war." Yet even he could not predict how soon or how devastating war would arrive. Just across the Pacific, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers advanced silently, carrying over 350 warplanes under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's command. Their mission was unprecedented, a surprise attack to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one strike. The date, December 7, 1941. For years, American leaders dismissed the Japanese military as incapable of long-range surprise attacks, believing Japan lacked the resources and daring. Even at Pearl Harbor, complacency allowed a radar sighting of incoming aircraft to be disregarded as American bombers. The mistake was deadly. To understand Japan's bold move, we must go back to January 1941 in Tokyo, where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, facing a dire shortage of resources and strangling American sanctions, crafted a daring plan. Innovation followed: special shallow-water torpedoes, new armor-piercing bombs, and hundreds of meticulously trained pilots. Many Japanese leaders doubted the plan, fearing it would wake a sleeping giant. But Yamamoto, having studied in America, warned that Japan could prosper only if victory was swift. At dawn, December 7th, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave of 183 warplanes over Oahu. At 7:49 a.m., the code Tora, Tora, Tora signaled total surprise. Within 2 hours, the USS Arizona exploded, the Oklahoma capsized, battleships burned, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives. The Pacific Fleet seemed broken, and America, along with the rest of the world, was left stunned by an attack that changed history forever. The immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack was chaos and disbelief. Thick, black smoke billowed into the sky as oil from ruptured fuel tanks ignited the waters of the harbor. Sailors dived into the flames to save comrades, while medics rushed to convert baseball fields and mess halls into makeshift hospitals. Across Hawaii, terrified civilians tuned into radio broadcasts, hearing the shocking words for the first time. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. In Washington, word reached President Roosevelt at 1:40 p.m. His face reportedly tightened, and in a rare silence, he gripped the arms of his chair. He knew instantly that the United States was at war. That evening, as Roosevelt dictated his speech to Congress, he carefully chose words that would echo for generations. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Yet for all of Japan's triumph that day, the attack was not the total victory Yamamoto had hoped for. 3 key American aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were not in Pearl Harbor during the strike. Their survival meant that America still had its most vital weapon intact. Furthermore, the Japanese failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's oil storage tanks and repair yards. Within weeks, the U.S. Navy was already patching up damaged ships, turning what had been a devastating blow into a temporary setback. And as the Japanese fleet turned back across the Pacific, sailors cheered wildly, convinced they had secured Japan's destiny. Commander Fuchida himself later wrote, "In that single moment, I felt as though I was standing on the pinnacle of victory." But behind this euphoria lurked a fatal miscalculation. Rather than crippling America into submission, the attack had awakened its fury. Admiral Yamamoto, more cautious than most of his colleagues, understood this truth at once. Hearing of the overwhelming success, he murmured, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That resolve became clear within hours. Across the nation, Americans who had once resisted involvement in the European War now rallied together with unprecedented unity. Recruitment offices overflowed as young men volunteered by the millions. Women prepared to step into factories, determined to forge the weapons of revenge. The United States had been divided by politics, isolationism, and economic struggles. But Pearl Harbor erased all doubt. For the first time since the Civil War, the nation was utterly united in purpose. On December 8th, Roosevelt delivered his Day of Infamy speech to Congress. It lasted barely 7 minutes, but when he finished, the entire chamber erupted in thunderous applause. Congress voted almost unanimously for war, 82-0 in the House, 82-1 in the Senate. The lone dissenting vote came from pacifist Jeannette Rankin, who had also opposed U.S. entry into World War I. But her solitary protest was drowned out by the overwhelming roar of a country now determined to fight. What Japan had not anticipated was America's sheer industrial capacity. Within weeks, automobile factories that once produced cars were retooled to build tanks, trucks, and airplanes. Shipyards worked around the clock, launching vessels at a pace no other nation could match. By 1943, the United States would be producing over 50,000 warplanes annually, a scale of manufacturing that dwarfed Japan's output. The very resource shortages that had driven Tokyo to war now became Japan's greatest weakness. Meanwhile, Germany made a fateful mistake. On December 11th, Adolf Hitler, confident that Japan's attack would cripple America for years, declared war on the United States. It was a disastrous gamble. Instead of keeping America isolated in the Pacific, Hitler's move ensured that U.S. industry and manpower would now be directed against the Third Reich as well. Historian Ian Kershaw later observed, "In a single stroke, Hitler had guaranteed the one outcome he most feared: a two-front war he could not win." In the space of just 4 days, the world had been transformed. Japan believed it had shocked America into retreat. Instead, it had shocked America into total war. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed to fulfill Admiral Yamamoto's prediction. Their forces would run wild for 6 months, striking in every direction with stunning speed. They began their lightning campaign just hours after attacking Hawaii. On December 8th, Japanese bombers swooped over the Philippines, pounding American airfields and sinking ships. General Douglas MacArthur, in command of U.S. forces in the Far East, was shocked by the ferocity. By Christmas Day, Japanese troops had landed on Luzon, pushing American and Filipino defenders into a desperate retreat. Simultaneously, Japan's armies surged through Southeast Asia. British Hong Kong fell on December 25th after just 18 days of fighting. In January 1942, Japanese forces stormed into Malaya, defeating British and Indian troops again and again. Their biggest target was Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East. Once called impregnable by Winston Churchill and home to 85,000 defenders, it fell on February 15, 1942. British commander Arthur Percival surrendered to a much smaller Japanese army. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. Australia's turn came that same month as Japanese carrier aircraft bombed the northern city of Darwin, killing over 230 people, the largest foreign attack on Australian soil ever recorded. Panic gripped the nation. Around the world, newspapers printed maps splashed in red, showing Japan's conquests stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands, threatening India and Australia. For a time, it seemed the Japanese Empire was truly unstoppable.
As Japanese fortunes peaked and began to decline, America's war machine was only just waking up. Pearl Harbor had not only united the nation emotionally, it had unleashed the full force of American industry. Within months of the attack, production figures skyrocketed to levels that dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 86,000 tanks, and more than 8,000 naval vessels. At the height of this mobilization, American factories were rolling a new Liberty ship off the docks every 4 days. By contrast, Japan's shipyards, strained by resource shortages and bombings, could never hope to match such output. The scale of mobilization was staggering. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, B-24 Liberator bombers, aircraft with 1.5 million parts, rolled off the assembly line at the rate of 1 every 63 minutes. In California, Henry Kaiser's shipyards pioneered new construction methods that cut building time for a full cargo vessel from months to mere weeks. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of millions of women entering the workforce, welding steel, riveting fuselages, and producing munitions at a pace the Axis powers could scarcely believe. It wasn't just machines, it was manpower. In 1942 alone, over 16 million Americans donned uniforms, swelling the armed forces into the largest the nation had ever fielded. Many were young farm boys or factory workers who just months before had never traveled far from home. Now, they were training to fight in jungles, deserts, and oceans thousands of miles away. Their sacrifice and determination became the backbone of the Allied effort. Japanese observers who studied these figures were stunned. One captured officer later admitted, "We believed America to be soft, divided, and weak. We did not realize that their capacity to fight was boundless once aroused." The sleeping giant Yamamoto had feared was no myth, it was reality. The first test of this new resolve came in the Solomon Islands, at Guadalcanal. In August 1942, American Marines landed on the island, seizing an unfinished Japanese airfield that would later be named Henderson Field. What followed was 6 months of some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific. The Japanese launched wave after wave of counterattacks, often at night, in desperate attempts to dislodge the Marines. Naval battles raged offshore, with carriers, cruisers, and destroyers clashing in bloody duels. Conditions on the island were hellish. Marines nicknamed it Starvation Island, surviving on meager rations while enduring malaria, dysentery, and relentless Japanese shelling. One Marine later recalled, "We lived like animals in the mud, but we held on because we knew if we lost Henderson Field, the Japanese would own the Pacific." The Japanese, too, suffered terribly. Their supply lines were harassed by American aircraft, leaving many soldiers to starve. Diaries recovered after the battle told of men reduced to eating roots and grass to survive. Despite their ferocity, the Japanese simply could not replace their mounting losses. Each plane shot down, each pilot killed, each ship sunk. These were losses Japan could not recover from, while America's factories ensured replacements kept arriving in endless waves. By February 1943, the Japanese High Command conceded the battle was unwinnable. They evacuated their surviving troops under cover of darkness. Guadalcanal had cost Japan over 30,000 men. For the Americans, it was a hard-fought victory that marked the beginning of an inexorable advance. Historian Richard Frank would later write, "Guadalcanal was the Pacific's Stalingrad. It was the place where Japanese expansion ended and Allied momentum began." From that moment, Japan was no longer on the offensive. The war had become a battle of attrition, one that Japan was doomed to lose. After Guadalcanal, the tide of war shifted decisively, and America began tightening the noose around Japan through a relentless strategy known as island hopping. Rather than attempting to reconquer every patch of Japanese-held territory, U.S. forces targeted key islands that could serve as stepping stones toward the Japanese homeland, bypassing others and leaving them isolated to wither. In November 1943, the campaign began at Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, where Marines waited ashore under withering fire in one of the bloodiest assaults of the war. The victory cost more than 1,000 American lives in just 3 days, shocking the public back home, but it proved that U.S. resolve would not falter. Next came the Marshalls and then the Marianas, where battles at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam turned the Central Pacific into an American stronghold. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese civilians, told by their military leaders that Americans would torture and kill them, leapt to their deaths from cliffs rather than surrender. The tragedy underscored the fanaticism that would define Japan's resistance to the end. Meanwhile, in the waters of the Philippine Sea, American carrier pilots annihilated Japanese air power in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroying more than 300 aircraft in a single day, while losing fewer than 30 of their own. Japan's naval aviation, once the terror of the Pacific, had been crippled beyond repair. Submarine warfare added to Japan's woes. U.S. submarines prowled the sea lanes, sinking merchant ships and tankers with ruthless efficiency. By 1945, more than 1,100 Japanese merchant vessels had been destroyed, cutting off the empire's lifeline of oil, food, and raw materials. Factories ground to a halt, aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel, and civilians faced hunger as rice imports dwindled. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet, later remarked, "We sank Japanese ships faster than they could build them, and faster than they could train men to sail them. The economic stranglehold was absolute. Yet the most visible devastation came from the skies." Beginning in late 1944, American B-29 Superfortress bombers, flying from bases in the Marianas, carried the war directly to Japan's cities. At first, they dropped bombs from high altitude, but the results were disappointing due to strong winds and poor accuracy. Then, under General Curtis LeMay, tactics changed. The bombers began low-level night raids using incendiaries, designed to ignite Japan's densely packed wooden cities. The results were catastrophic. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 279 B-29s dropped nearly 1,700 tons of firebombs on Tokyo. In just 3 hours, 16 square miles of the city were incinerated, more than 100,000 people killed, and over 1 million left homeless. Survivors described rivers boiling with bodies, entire neighborhoods vanishing in flames, mothers carrying charred infants in their arms. It was the deadliest single air raid in history, surpassing even Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Other cities soon shared Tokyo's fate. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, one by one, they burned. By the summer of 1945, more than 60 Japanese cities had been reduced to rubble, and millions were homeless. Japan's once proud empire, which had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor, now stood battered and starving, its navy destroyed, its skies dominated, its cities in ashes. And yet, incredibly, Japan's leaders refused to surrender. The fanatic belief in fighting to the last man remained, and with each passing day the cost of ending the war grew higher. By the spring of 1945, the path to Japan's homeland narrowed to one last bloody stepping stone: Okinawa. Barely 350 miles from Kyushu, it was the final island needed for staging a full invasion of Japan itself. On April 1st, American forces landed in what would become the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The Japanese, entrenched in caves and bunkers, unleashed hell. Wave after wave of kamikaze aircraft dove into U.S. ships, turning the sea into a graveyard of burning steel. Over 1,900 kamikaze pilots sacrificed themselves during the battle, sinking more than 30 American vessels and damaging nearly 400 others. One survivor later recalled, "They came from the sky like falling stars, and each one carried death with it." On land, Okinawa was worse still. Nearly 180,000 Japanese soldiers defended the island, and they fought with a tenacity born of desperation. For 82 days, Marines and Army troops clawed forward, yard by yard, through mud, rain, and blood. When it was finally over, more than 12,000 Americans were dead, another 50,000 wounded. Japan lost nearly its entire garrison, and as many as 100,000 civilians perished, many forced by propaganda into mass suicides. General Simon Buckner, commander of U.S. forces on Okinawa, himself was killed by enemy fire in the closing days, the highest-ranking American officer lost in the war. The ferocity of Okinawa convinced American planners that an invasion of Japan would cost unthinkable casualties. Estimates ranged from 250,000 to 1 million American dead, and perhaps 5 to 10 million Japanese. But even as Japan's position became hopeless, its leaders clung to the dream of conditional surrender, still hoping to preserve their emperor and their regime. Then, in August 1945, history shifted in a single, shattering instant. On August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay released a single bomb over Hiroshima. In seconds, a blinding flash lit the sky, followed by a roaring firestorm that flattened 5 square miles of the city. More than 70,000 people were killed instantly, tens of thousands more in the days and weeks that followed. The weapon was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a force equal to 15,000 tons of TNT unleashed in one blast. 3 days later, on August 9th, another bomb fell on Nagasaki, killing at least 40,000 in an instant. But even as Japanese leaders reeled from the destruction, a new blow arrived. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. In just days, the Red Army crushed Japan's elite Kwantung Army, once considered its most powerful force. Surrounded by flames at home, losing its empire abroad, Japan's options vanished. Emperor Hirohito, breaking with centuries of tradition, finally intervened. On August 15, 1945, his voice crackled over the radio in Japan's first-ever imperial broadcast. The people, many hearing him for the first time, wept as he declared, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have resolved to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable." It was a surrender, the moment the rising sun finally set. Across the world, from London to Washington to Manila, bells rang, crowds danced in the streets, and weary soldiers dropped their weapons and cried. The war that began with a shocking attack on Pearl Harbor ended in equally shocking destruction, leaving Japan in ruins but setting the stage for a new world order. And yet, the lesson of Pearl Harbor remained etched into memory, that arrogance and underestimation can awaken giants, and that wars begun in overconfidence can end in utter devastation. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Japan stood in stunned disbelief at what had transpired. The same nation that had once prided itself on discipline, honor, and the samurai spirit now saw its great cities reduced to ashes, its navy at the bottom of the sea, and its people starving. Prisoners of war, once conditioned to believe America was a weak, decadent nation, were bewildered when they saw the true scale of U.S. might. Diaries recovered from Japanese officers expressed shock that a nation so casually dismissed as soft had not only mobilized industry but produced more aircraft, ships, and tanks than the Axis combined. One officer, captured in the Philippines, admitted, "We believed the Americans could not fight. And then we watched as their factories and their fleets overwhelmed us like an endless tide." The irony was bitter. The very arrogance that led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor blinded its leaders to the reality of American strength. The war had begun with a single strike meant to paralyze America. Instead, it had galvanized the United States into an industrial and military giant, one capable of delivering destruction on a scale never before seen in human history. And for the Japanese people, the aftermath was a reckoning. Millions were homeless, food shortages gripped the nation, and the once feared empire faced occupation by foreign troops. Yet, from this devastation arose something remarkable. Under American guidance, Japan embraced democracy, rebuilt its economy, and transformed itself into one of the world's most advanced nations within a single generation. In a profound twist of fate, the country that had shocked the world with war at Pearl Harbor would later shock it again, this time with peace, prosperity, and technological innovation. But the legacy of Pearl Harbor remained, not just for Japan and America, but for the entire world. Historians often point to December 7, 1941, as the day the United States awoke to its role as a global superpower, the moment isolationism gave way to leadership. The lesson is timeless. Underestimating a free people is the gravest mistake a dictatorship can make. Japan's leaders believed material comfort and democracy were weaknesses, yet they became the very source of America's strength, the ability to unite millions of workers, soldiers, and citizens in a common cause, sustained by the promise of liberty. As General Dwight Eisenhower later reflected, "It is not the guns and planes, but the spirit of free men that wins wars." And so, the story of Pearl Harbor is more than just a tale of planes and ships. It is a warning against arrogance and a reminder of the resilience of free nations. From the burning wrecks of Battleship Row to the ashes of Tokyo and Hiroshima, the arc of the war tells a single story: that those who believe freedom breeds weakness will always be proven wrong. For in the clash between tyranny and liberty, history shows that liberty endures and tyranny crumbles.